Hello. As I speak, it is October 1st, 2019. This is the 70th anniversary of the communist takeover of the People's Republic of China. In China right now, President Xi and his leadership are celebrating their successes and their triumphs. I want to bear witness to my distant understanding of what those 70 years have actually meant to the people who've lived there. First of all, what does communist rule in the CCP mean to the people of Hong Kong? They were promised in 1996 that for 50 years they would be part of China, one country, but with two systems: communism on the mainland, but a continuation of colonial British democracy in Hong Kong. And yet, right now, as we speak, the people of Hong Kong are under an existential threat. The Chinese military is upping its presence on the island and in the former colony. The people on mainland China are rallying or being riled up into a froth to rally for a forcible solution to the problem. And the police in Hong Kong no longer work along British lines of limited authority and a minimum of force. They're engaged in open brutality. And agents provocateurs within the protest movement, paid for by the police and the People's Liberation Army, are trying to bring discredit to the protesters by injecting violence. Why? Because the Hong Kongers have the temerity to demand freedom. They have 5 simple demands, the most fundamental of which is popular sovereignty. In other words, the right to choose their leaders. A right that we in the West take for granted, but a right that they absolutely have not had since the takeover in 1996. Carrie Lam, the administrator of Hong Kong, is there because Beijing wants her there, because the Chinese Communist Party wants her there. So hurrah from the standpoint of Hong Kong, where a major part, over 2 million people, have recently taken part in protests. The island is now, and the colony is now, facing the threat of a new and even greater Tiananmen Square massacre. Let's consider the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, China's northwest province, a desert province populated by ethnic Turkish minorities or Turkic minorities who are Islamic. Over 1 million Uyghurs are in re-education camps built to strip Xinjiang of any distinct cultural minority, using old tried and true techniques of torture and brainwashing, combined with new high-tech surveillance and drugs. The people of Xinjiang, the ethnic Uyghurs, the native population, is being broken. They're being rebuilt as loyal communists and as culturally indistinguishable from any Han Chinese. And of course, those who refuse to accept the new order face an existential genocide of their culture and perhaps of all people still loyal to it. North Korea, what more need be said than North Korea would not exist if it was not for the People's Republic of China and the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Everything that Kim Jong-un, his father and his grandfather, have done has been with the approval of and the encouragement of the Chinese Communist Party's leadership. The Communist Party is in the process of laying claim to every scrap of land and a bunch of things that aren't really scraps of land in both the East China Sea and the South China Sea, which threatens the territorial sovereignty of every state washed by those bodies of water. As to Taiwan, the genuine Republic of China, a place that proves that Chinese cultural characteristics can result in a functioning multi-party democracy, Well, the Chinese Communist leadership has promised to settle the Taiwan question by reason or force by 2020. Along the Vietnamese border, there is the ever-present threat of a war breaking out because of the long-term hatred between Vietnamese and Chinese, and because of the simple volatility of that border. The last time it broke out was in 1979, but there's no doubt, there's no assurance that it wouldn't break out suddenly again. The Chinese are investing heavily in Myanmar or Burma because no one else will, to expand their power. And along the Indo-Pakistani Chinese border, Nepalese border in the Himalayas, the Chinese communists are pushing, and the intensity of border incidents and border skirmishes has gone up systematically over the last 20 years. The Chinese Communist Party is everywhere along its frontier, threatening to expand at the expense of its neighbors to supposedly reclaim ancient Chinese territory. The only nation that they're not overtly doing this with is Russian Siberia, and that's because Vladimir Putin is in effect a client state. Putin's Russia is a client state of the People's Republic of China. So why would the Chinese Communist Party risk open war simultaneously on several fronts? For the same reason that the Chinese Communist Party has instituted in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and elsewhere an unprecedented surveillance state, combining cutting-edge Western technologies provided by collaborating Western tech companies, American tech companies, and native-grown Chinese virtual and artificial intelligence. They have set up a system of ubiquitous cameras everywhere, replete with microphones and face recognition technology. A surveillance state that would make George Orwell's Oceania seem like child's play. A surveillance state where everyone is tracked by computer constantly, and algorithms are used to assess each individual a social credit score. If you are a loyal son of the party, you get opportunities to live where you want, work where you want, and have a decent standard of living in terms of the calories you take in, and even possibly entertainment and foreign travel. But if you are stubborn and anti-socialist and insist on maintaining your own independent attitudes against that of the party, well, all of the privileges that we take for granted, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the privileges, the rights that socialists claim, the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to clothing, the right to a job, all of that can be taken away. Not even by a human being, by a computer algorithm. Xinjiang is also a test bed for China's other great industry, the harvesting of organs for the international black market. But it's not just Uyghurs that are being harvested. Sometimes they're left alive after a kidney is taken out or a lung is taken out. Sometimes the prisoner, the political prisoner, the Uyghur, is simply killed and harvested for organs. What they have done to the Falun-Gong meditation movement is an example of their willingness to go well beyond ethnic Uyghurs and former British colonials in their quest for total power. The Falun-Gong movement is nothing more than an intensely spiritual variant of Tai Chi, and yet the Chinese Communist Party under Jiang Zemin and Xi Jinping have systematically targeted them for arrest, torture, and organ harvesting. For being willing to engage in public meditation, Falun Gong practitioners have been deemed to be enemies of the state. All of this, the internal repression, the external adventurism, is because the Chinese party, while seeming to be incredibly strong, is actually desperately weak and absolutely fearful of its own people. Since Tiananmen Square, any thinking Chinese party leader knows that the people of China do not support communism willingly. They have no legitimacy, no moral right to rule. Instead, there's a combination of carrot and stick that communists have used since Tiananmen Square to hold on to power. While most people in China since 1989 have waited for the old butchers of Tiananmen to die, Jiang Zemin and now Xi Jinping have extended the rule of that type of totalitarianism by offering the carrot of an improving living standard and the stick of absolutely overtly brutal repression, gratuitously brutal repression against anyone who publicly engages in political discourse outside of communist limits. The world economy has been very friendly to China's developing status since before Tiananmen Square, since the 1970s, since Deng Xiaoping visited the United States in Jimmy Carter's presidency. But global markets are changing. China's status is no longer that of a developing nation. It's now the second biggest economy in the world. They are heavily industrialized. And the global market is approaching glut. For the last couple of years, it's not simply the trade war with the United States that has slowed the growth of China's economy. It's also just the realities of international economics. Without the carrot of a steadily increasingly material lifestyle, the Chinese Communist Party has nothing to offer but terror to their own people. So if the global marketplace will not permit the Chinese Communist Party to continue to give the loyal, quiet people stuff, then what will they do to prevent rebellion, to prevent civil war? Well, one of the things they will likely do is absolutely brutally crack down in Hong Kong, regardless of the international response. The people who lead China simply cannot allow the people who live in China to think that a person can get away with independent thought. In fact, they've ramped up the terror campaign by trying to rake in old enmities. Chinese television and popular culture is suffused with anti-Japanese propaganda, trying to bring back vivid memories of the rape of Nanking and other genuine war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Imperial Japanese before the close of World War II. But there is no distinction between past and present in this propaganda. What there is a very blatant and crude attempt to whip up anti-Japanese sentiment, a violent outrage that at some point is going to need to be unleashed. While they're stoking the fires of anti-Japanese nationalism, attitudes towards all foreigners has reverted to a Qing Dynasty foreign devil model, where foreigners are considered to be unified against Han Chinese. Ethnic minorities and cultural minorities within China are suspect, and every single foreign nation not under the thumb of Beijing is considered to be an enemy outside of China. If the economy of global marketplaces do not allow the butchers of Beijing to continue to give their people an increasing living standard, what they have to offer is a rally around the flag foreign conflict. The reason that China is so bellicose and saber-rattling is because, in fact, minor war or something short of war with the West, with other countries in the East, would suit them domestically. It would have the tendency of squelching dissent within China and causing the Chinese people to rise up and revenge themselves upon a world for their century of shame, the so-called century of shame, a period from the 1842 Anglo-Chinese Opium War through the communist victory in 1949. Chinese leaders, in fact, behave as if the world was a world of competing great powers like they were during the height of European imperialism 130 years ago. They speak in terms of regaining old territory. They are engaged in a global Belt and Road Initiative, which is absolutely designed to trap poor and medium-sized countries in debt traps, whose only solution is to grant Chinese military and corporate assets 99-year leases on strategic locations around the world. The 99-year lease was the classic way in which Britain got a hold of Hong Kong and Germany got a hold of Qingdao in Shantung province. It is a former colonial power, or colonized power, revenging itself on the colonial powers. The leaders of China are comfortable with this model. They see themselves as the underdog. They have a story of justice and revenge. The problem is that the Chinese leadership is ignorant of the lessons that American and Soviet leaders learned from 1945 until 1991. The Cold War was a time when the kind of jingoistic, rabid nationalism that China is hearkening back to was no longer appropriate because we had atomic and hydrogen weapons capable of ending all life on Earth. Instead, the American and Russian leadership and our close allies in Europe learned to do a very, very careful dance, where we would challenge one another where we could, but only in an area that the enemy would be willing to lose gracefully. We didn't push each other too far, because had we done so, Armageddon could have resulted. This restraint, this maturity, if you will, in foreign policy is alien to the experiences of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. Instead, they really are behaving like it's the 1890s. And that means that there is the potential for a terrible miscalculation. They might calculate that for domestic reasons, not only must they suppress Hong Kong, but they must go across Formosa Strait and try to forcibly reunite Taiwan with China. They may also calculate, much as the Japanese High Command did before December 7th, 1941, that the absolute requirement for success in this endeavor is the elimination of the threat of the American Pacific Fleet. So such an attack may be accompanied by shock attacks against carrier groups and bases throughout the Pacific Rim. They may calculate, as the Japanese did, that the Americans will not have a stomach for fight and will withdraw and allow them to build a new Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That would be quite a miscalculation. But instead of resulting in a Pacific War, 1941-45 style, it could very well result in a global thermonuclear exchange that it turns out to be unlimited. But for domestic political reasons, and because of the limits of their experience, it's quite thinkable for the Chinese Communist leadership to engage in such brinksmanship, more than brinksmanship, overt attacks. Their tradition, their real tradition, comes from Mao Zedong. It is a tradition of total power. Mao Zedong, in pursuit of his goals, initiated the Great Leap Forward, a campaign to collectivize Chinese agriculture. When that was stopped by elements within the Chinese Communist leadership because of the megadeath that it was producing in the rural and urban populations, Mao stepped back, seemed to give in, and then a few years later struck with the second step in his campaign, the Cultural Revolution, a conscious attempt to eliminate all traditional Chinese culture and absolutely every other opinion maker and faction within the Chinese Communist Party. In the course of these two events, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, between 60 and 120 million Chinese were murdered in peacetime by their own government's policies. When Mao was faced with these realities, he said, well, there's always more where that came from. He also said, history comes out of the barrel of a gun. Mao was comfortable with policies that murdered tens of millions of Chinese because it resulted in no one having power but him. Now, by comparison, Joseph Stalin, whose policies inspired Mao, killed between 30 and 60 million Russians and Soviet subjects in peacetime. Hitler, including World War II, well, Hitler's policy killed between 14 and 20 million. So the people who rule in Beijing today are the inheritors of the greatest mass murderer in human history by far, and a tradition that will brook no opposition, that abides no limits to their authority. And given that they are more afraid and more weak than they want to seem to the rest of the world, this makes them potentially desperate. Desperate enough to try something truly dangerous. Add to this the results of decades-long policies of one couple, one child, producing tens of millions of more military-aged Chinese men than women, which is so culturally destabilizing that right now mass immigration of brides from Southeast Asia is occurring. Chinese men are finding mail-order brides and bringing them in by the millions. But with so many extra military-aged men, the temptation must be to use them. And who's going to stand against the Chinese Communist Party? The traditional center of Chinese civilization, the family, was destroyed by the Cultural Revolution, one couple, one child. Families in China today are broken. Most everyone who's old enough to remember the Cultural Revolution is some version of walking wounded. The people on the mainland have not been encouraged to think for themselves. Quite the contrary. They've been encouraged to feel wrath when their masters sound the whistle of nationalism. All of this means that the 70th anniversary of Mao's victory in the Chinese Civil War on October 1st, 1949, is certainly no cause for celebration. What it is a cause for is a reevaluation of American policy, both civil and government, towards China. No American company should be under the delusion that they will be allowed to truly profit from China long term. The Chinese will bring your company in, steal your intellectual property, and then sooner or later push you out in every way possible. They may allow you to make some money, but it will be absolutely on their terms. But understand what you're doing. Like the American tech companies that are building China's surveillance state, you are building a new totalitarianism. We need to reevaluate trade policy with China, diplomatic relationships with China, and instead of being passive, we should aggressively try to build alliances around China. We should aggressively try to oppose and compete with One Belt, One Road, and we should stand up for the human right to privacy and the human right to freedom of conscience in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Macau, and in China itself. Because like Germans were the first and greatest, well, in some ways, the greatest victims of Hitler, not in every way. Chinese are the first, and certainly the most numerically great victims, thus far anyway, of the Chinese Communist Party. Happy 70th anniversary, China. Hopefully your fate will be something like the Soviet Union, which just after its 70th anniversary was taken back by its people, at least until the time of Putin. Think on this. Thank you. Be well.